Okay, let's see, since I'm very short and even though I'm wearing platforms, it's still not seeing me. I stand there, so I'll stand here. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So good afternoon, everybody, and it gives me great pleasure to be here. Of course, like everybody else who talked before me, I think with a lot of fondness about Zvia. And for some reason, I have this one memory of sitting with her in some lovely restaurant, looking at the bay here, drinking wine and talking interchangeably about reading fluency, and our children and their partners and all that, and kind of switching back. And so that's kind of the image that I have of her. So, like my predecessors, I'm dedicating this talk to her. It's Zvia. So let's go. I should say that I'm delving into something that is sort of a new topic for me, and it's, maybe that's something the students in the audience should know, that we've kind of started to write a paper, and then we go back and do more analysis, and so it's that kind of stage where we are now, and it will be actually great to get feedback from people in the audience. So let's hit the road. There's a problem this way. It's my slide. Okay, let's try this way. So over the years, as Shelley mentioned, I've done quite a few studies on issues concerning second language learning, both in typically developing and non-typically developing. So I'll talk later about some of the longitudinal study that we did. We also examined in various studies universal versus some language-specific phenomena, transfer, if you want to call it, both in terms of language and literacy. And we also studied the factors that predict development over time. And the one that I'm going to focus on now in particular is the last bit, which is this, how can we identify reliably learning disabilities in second language learners. So one of the things when I kind of got into this field, and I'm at OISI, and I'm assuming that many people in the audience know Jim Cummings, and who was just retiring now, but he was my colleague at OISI, and he was going all over the world talking about how it's biased to identify immigrant kids as having a learning disability. And in fact, at that time, when he started to do this research, they would give IQ tests to immigrant kids who just arrived and then decided they were slow learners and put them in special programs for slow learners. And he was definitely right that was the wrong way to go about it. But when I got involved in this area, and I was coming from the perspective of learning disabilities, and at that time, Linda and I were colleagues, and I was definitely learned a lot from Linda. And the problem was that we could see children who actually, who were immigrant kids, who were ESL, and who had a learning disability, but the system would not assess them because everywhere it was this policy, thou shalt not assess until the kid has had enough time to learn English, or English in the case of Canada and the US. And so sometimes we would see kids who were already in Canada for 5 years, so by now they're maybe grade 5 or 6, and still nobody will assess them because they need to have more opportunities to learn English. Okay, so the focus was on English, and in some ways I think it's almost a parallel the kind of whole language debate. So I think in the second language domain was this thing of, don't look at the basics, so just give the kids more opportunities to learn English. So that kind of got me motivated. I got really upset and angry. Okay, so there's something wrong with that, and so that kind of propels me to this day. So the question was, how can we piece this apart? And so Jim Cummings talked about over-identification of minority kids as having learning problems. And by the time we got involved in this, this is a paper we published in the year 2000, so by that time we already had some longitudinal data on ESLs. We found that actually in Toronto there was under-identification. And I've just read a paper that was published this year by Solari and some others, and apparently that's true at the moment in the US as well. A huge data set finding the same thing. So what you get is that ESL kids, so on the one hand you want to avoid bias, you don't want to over-identify, but by not identifying, you're introducing another kind of bias. So that's kind of the problem that we're dealing with, and that I'm trying to kind of tease apart. Okay, so Linda did a sales pitch at the end. I'm going to do it right at the beginning. It's a book that I just published with my colleague Judy Wiener. It just came out last summer, and it sort of is a combination of both my research and my clinical work, because I'm in the program we train students to become clinicians, on how to actually go about assess kids who may have a learning disability, come from some kind of cultural difference and or second background. So that's my sales pitch, and that I will not do it, more of that. Oh, should I do the picture? Okay. So one of the things that I also wanted to share with you, just as a sort of a general introduction, because I find that sometimes I get attacked with different things, like how you look at this and not at that. This, at the moment, is kind of an overall model of how I see all the factors that contribute to reading comprehension in second language. And so if you look at the middle here, that's kind of where the simple review of reading did reside to some extent. So you have various aspects of language and various aspects of the decoding and reading, but then I added from my experience and from my research some other elements such as text structure, group strategies, which was talked about yesterday. Also notice I'm distinguishing between text fluency and word fluency, and I don't have time to talk about it today. I think that's an important distinction to make. And then on the side, we have all these other things that contribute as well. And each of those can be, of course, expanded into a big model. I'm just trying to put it all in one picture. So here we have things such as background knowledge of the cognition. I'm talking about cognition because what's cognition? Working memory, memory, all that is here. The impact of first language literacy, so if you want to think about it as transfer, either positive or negative. What is the nature of the first language? And then all these things here. I don't have the time to talk about more of this, but if you want, you can ask me later. Okay, so the other thing which I want to say is that as a result of doing longitudinal research, one develops some insights, and especially with regard to this issue of how the second language, both the oral language and the reading skills, how did they develop over time? What does it look like when you're typically developing any of second language learning? What does it look like when you're not typically developing your second language? So when developing, I've developed some insights about some things that I think we should be doing. And one of them is this thing that it's important to, when we do research on, longitudinal research on second language learners, that it's important to compare performance to the relevant reference group rather than to the general average. So basically what I'm saying is, what we need to do is look at the trajectory of development of the group and say, how are these kids doing in relation to other kids like them? So you have 100 Punjabi kids in your classroom in your school, and then maybe 5 Punjabi kids who may have a serious problem with decoding in relation to other Punjabi kids. So by doing that, I've shown in a number of studies that we actually avoid the over-identification bias. Okay, another point is that, and that's kind of obvious, I think, but that we should strive for having the same percentage of children who have various aspects of various types of learning problems. We should not find something, if we find 50% of our ESLs as having language impairment, there's something wrong, right? But if we know that in the general population, language impairment is whatever, let's say 5%, we should not expect to find 0% in the second language, nor should we find 50%. Okay, so that's an obvious point that I think needs to be stated. The other thing which I've kind of learned is that it's useful to consider convergent developmental patterns, and I'll talk more about that. So one thing is that you can look at development in general, but what I'm going to look at in a moment is some subgroups of patterns of subgroups of learners. The other thing which I've come to realize is that the nature of predictors is not static and it changes over time. And I'll show 1 or 2 examples of that. So in other words, usually part of that also comes with kind of our access to sophisticated statistics. Well, we have to have a big data set and longitudinal is one thing, but the other thing is that the kind of statistical techniques that we have available to us today enable us to ask questions not such as how does, let's say, phonemic awareness at age 5 predict reading comprehension in grade 10 or whatever. So that would be kind of the typical two-point comparisons, but we can now start to look at patterns of change, and we can ask questions such as, does phonemic awareness predict in grade 5, or does it predict only at age 5? And something else emerges as an important kind of aspect of language cognition, which is active when you're in grade 5, let's say. Okay? So that's what I mean by this notion of static versus changes over time. So these are some of the things that we've learned. Okay, and the other thing that you learned is that, and that's something I'll repeat a few times, and Linda mentioned it already in her talk, is that there's no need to wait until language proficiency is adequate, whatever adequate is, and that we need to provide instruction when we see there's a problem. That's a point that Linda definitely articulated much better than I'm doing at the time. Okay. So I want to talk very briefly about two studies that kind of led to the study that I'm going to focus on today. So one is a study where we looked at the vocabulary development trajectories of ELLs and reversible monolinguals, and another one is a study where we looked at reading comprehension. So this is a paper that we published a few years ago, and it represents the development of receptive vocabulary, so the PPVT, which I believe we also had in 1979 adapted to Hebrew by Niveau and somebody else. And what I'm trying to use most of the time, I'm using blue for the monolinguals and red for the ELLs. Okay, so it's trying to be consistent. So this is longitudinal data we have on these kids from grade 1 to grade 6. So every year they do the PPVT. And this is sort of a summary of the trajectories of the ESL and monolinguals with a whole sample over 6 years. And what do we see? What we see is that in grade 1, this of course is a big difference between the monolinguals and the ESL. By definition, the ESLs are ESL, expect that. The other thing which we see is that in fact they all learn, that's good news. And in fact, the slope of learning words for the ESL is steeper in the early years, and then it kind of starts to level off. And the other thing which we see, which is unfortunate, is a fact of life, is that even in grade 6, even though the difference between, on average, the vocabulary knowledge of the monolinguals and the ESLs is smaller, it's still significant. So even after being for 6 years in an English-speaking environment in Metro Toronto, the ESLs still know fewer words on average than their monolingual counterparts. Okay? Okay. The other study which I wanted to share with you, which led directly to what I'm going to talk about today, is based on the paper that we published just 2 years ago. And what I'm showing you here is reading comprehension. It's the Gates-McGinty reading comprehension test. And so what we have here are both the ESL kids and the monolinguals who every year in grades 4, 5, and 6 they do the Gates-McGinty. The whole setup here is not, it doesn't work for me. Okay. Okay. So what we see is that the ESL, so this is the trajectory for the ESL children, and this is the trajectory for the monolingual children on the Gates-McGinty test. So what we see is that first of all, there's of course that has been reported in other studies as well, except for that has different results. The ESL kids reading comprehension in general, at each time from both grade 4, grade 5, and grade 6 is significantly lower than that of the monolingual children. But the other thing that's really upsetting is that in fact the gap in grade 6 is larger than it was earlier. And that kind of brought us to also the study I want to talk about. So why is it that the gap is actually starting to be larger was the question. so maybe there's some subgroups we didn't get sampled. Okay. So here is one of the analysis that we did in this particular case. It's the same group as this, except that now we're digging further in. And what we're looking at is the extent to which vocabulary knowledge early in grades 1 and 2, and grammatical knowledge early predicts the development, the trajectory of reading comprehension development in these kids. And so what we see here, which is really interesting, is that between grade 4 and 5, you see both if you're low or high on vocabulary, or whether you're low or high on syntax, the trajectories are the same. But around grade 5, suddenly this opening up, this fanning out. And suddenly what we see is the following. If you're high in vocabulary and you're high in syntax, your comprehension is very good. You're doing the best. If you are high vocabulary and low syntax, you're slightly lower. This is if you're low vocabulary and high syntax. So again, syntax is important. Something becomes more important. And if you're low in both, well, you're screwed. Right? Okay, so what we see is this kind of opening up, which is related actually to syntax, because vocabulary does not distinguish from grade 5 to 6. Something else is happening. Syntax is not vocabulary. So that's one of the findings for that study. And here what we did was we looked, okay, what about cognitive measures? So the one that, so we looked at the contribution of phonological short-term memory, and we combined them. And what we see here is the following, that if you have high syntax and high phonological short-term memory, this is how your comprehension trajectory looks like over time. If you have low in both, if you're low in both, you look different. And the other two combinations are kind of in between. So that kind of makes us think maybe what we saw as a drop in the reading comprehension that I showed you in the 3 graphs ago, maybe there's some subgroups within that. So we wanted to probe that further. So we started to look at some of the literature on poor comprehension and language impairment, and just cited here some studies. So we know that kids who have poor comprehension have difficulties with vocabulary, syntactic processing, with understanding figurative language, with text integration and monitoring skills, and inferencing abilities are some of the things that we talked about yesterday. Another thing which the literature suggests is that these kids have difficulties at the text level, but not at the word level. So really we're talking about kids who don't have problems with decoding, but there's the problems that emerge in their comprehension and their ability to process language. Okay, so that leads me to the present study, where we were looking at late emerging language impairment. And I'm going to look at their cognitive profiles of these kids, and their phonological processing profiles, and then their language profiles in the next few slides. So here's the design. In fact, that design applies to the previous studies that I described to you. So what we did was we basically collected data for 10 years. Each year, for 4 consecutive years, we recruited ESL and monolingual children from grade 1, and we followed them for 6 years. So since we had 4 consecutive cohorts, by the time we finished collecting data, it took us 10 years. And they came from 4 different areas in the Metro Toronto. And one thing which I did not tell you is that Toronto is considered one of the most multicultural cities in the world, and roughly 4 to 5, almost half of the people who live in Toronto don't speak English or French as their first language. So people come from a lot of different places. Okay. So here's the design. We had altogether 400 ELL kids, more or less the same males and females. and we had 150 monolingual kids. And I should point out that monolingual kids came from the same schools as the ESL kids, okay? And we had 14 different schools. The language spoken at that time in the schools where we were doing our research were Punjabi, Tamil, Urdu, Cantonese, Portuguese, and why those languages? Because this is at the time where people come from. People immigrate at different times from different places. If we were to do the study today, we would probably have a lot of kids from Syria, for instance. Okay, so it depends on what happens in the world. Okay. So in terms of the measures that we gave them, and let me point out, it's an OTNL project. We gave those measures every year for 6 years. Okay. So nonverbal ability, working memory, phonological short-term memory. Now, being in Israel, I can share with you. The very first year we used a phonological short-term memory that was developed by Badley, which includes, requires children to repeat nonsense words, and the words gradually become longer, but they're nonsense words. And when we looked with my students in the lab at the time at those words, we said, well, they look like English words. So we said, well, that would make it easier for the monolinguals to do it. So how about we develop a phonological short-term memory task that's equally difficult for the monolinguals and the ESLs. And yours truly, I developed a phonological short-term memory task that's based on Hebrew. Because you know what? It sounded Hebrew to all of them. Because we didn't have any Semitic languages represented in our sample. So it was equally hard for both the monolinguals and the ESLs. And in fact, it did a better job of predicting vocabulary development than the Badley test. But that's the other paper. That's not what I'm talking about today. Okay, phonological short-term memory and phonological awareness, the usual suspects. I'm going to spend time on describing it in terms of language measures. We had the receptive vocabulary, the PPVT that I just talked about a minute ago. And in terms of grammatical knowledge, we had 2 measures. One is based on the self-CELF, which is the clinical evaluation of language functions. It has different subcomponents. One of them is called formulated sentences. So in this task, the kids actually have to, you give the kid a word and a picture, and they have to generate a sentence. Okay? So it takes them millions of hours to score it, but done it. And the other grammar measure was based on the writing task that we gave them, and on top of that, we gave them word reading. And so here are some of the general results, and I've talked about it in other sessions, including here at Haifa, but just to remind you, in case you don't remember, what we found in general when we compare the monolingual and the ESL kids, this is grade 1 skills on rapid naming, no difference between an ELL and monolinguals, phonological awareness, no difference between them, phonological short-term memory, no difference. Word reading, they also talked about it. Actually, there's no difference in accuracy based on whether they're L1 or not. Working memory, no difference. Where there are differences in terms of being L1 versus L2 is in terms of language. By definition, on vocabulary, we know fewer words, and on grammar, they're lower. Okay? So far so good? Okay. Okay, now we get into the complicated stuff. What we wanted to do is define kids who have different patterns. For instance, those who have dyslexia, does it stay the same over time? If they have a language problem, we wanted kids who have consistent language problems, because when you have longitudinal data, it could be that if you assess them in time 5, suddenly the kid is above the cutoff point. But by the time 6 and the time 3, they are below the cutoff points, right? So we had to come up with an idea of how to actually define who is indeed a kid who has a language impairment or a decoding problem. And today I'm only focusing on the language impairment, I'm not talking about decoding. So the way we did that, we said that to be early emerging, in other words, right from grade 1, the kids had to, in 4 out of the 6 times they were measured, they would have to have at least one stagnation below the mean on the vocabulary. So that's for the early emerging. Those are right from grade 1, we think are at risk for having a language problem. The group that I'm focusing on today are what we call the late emerging, and here what we said, we would classify them as having a language impairment, a late emerging language impairment, if they had one standard deviation below the mean on the two measures of syntax that I just mentioned, 2 out of 3 times. So we measured them in grades 4, 5, and 6, so at least in 2 of those grades they should have at least one standard deviation below the mean on 2 measures of syntax. It's very, I think, rigorous way of defining it, okay? And then for those who we wanted to actually remove kids who also had a decoding problem. So for the decoding, again, we define kids who had a reading disability based on word reading. If 4 out of the 6 times of measurement from grade 1 to 6, there were at least one standard deviation below the mean. Okay? So now, here's what we found in terms of the proportion of kids who fit each of those criteria. The first one is the early language immersion, early LI, and that's the first. Here, there's no difference between the proportion of children who are ESL or monolinguals who have early emerging LI. Okay, based on, as I said, 4 out of 6 times they have to be at least one time below the mean of vocabulary. This is for the late emerging. Again, no difference between them. And these are the kids who are dyslexic, who have decoding problems, and no language impairment problems. Okay? So from now on, I'm going to focus only on this group. Okay, that's for today's talk, which I'm almost done with, but we should be glad that that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so here, what did we find? So the first, what I'm showing you here is the comparison within the ELL group and within the monolingual group on these various cognitive and language measures that we had. And here we're looking at how they're doing in grade 1 on those measures. So what do we see? If you look at late LI, late language impairment, versus non-LI, who are ELL, we see that they're the same in rapid naming, the same in phonological awareness, the same in phonological short-term memory, the same in word reading, working memory. Where the two groups differ from each other is on language, vocabulary, and grammar. So those kids who are ELL and who are late AI have low vocabulary and low grammar. In the case of the monolingual kids, there's no difference in any of them. Now, when we look at the grade 3 measures, same cognitive measures, we see that by now the LI and the non-LI, whether they're monolingual or ESL, look the same on all these measures. Grade 5, what do we see in grade 5? Here looks something very interesting. On vocabulary, we see that the late LI who are ELLs are lower than those who are not LI. And then from then on, both from the 2 measures of grammar and the writing sample, the late LI are lower than the non-LI, whether they're monolingual or ESL. Okay, did I lose everybody? No? No. Okay. So now, I've said 2 things. It looks like we have this group of LI that problems with language, and with the problems with language appear to emerge in grade 5, even though we did not see them earlier. And now the question is, we did multiple logistic regression to see if we can, on the basis of the variables that appear to be relevant, whether we could classify the kids correctly to be LI and not LI. And so we did an odds ratio analysis, and the question was whether we could, on the basis of the multiple, we could, on these various independent variables, predictors, predict whether someone is LI or not LI. So how did we do? We did extremely well. The grade 1 and grade 3 models were statistically significant in distinguishing between those who were LI and not LI. 93% of the ELLs and 95% of the monolinguals who we thought on the basis of our classification that they were LI were correctly classified on the basis of the predictors. Okay, how can late emerging language impairment be identified then by cognitive? So it looks like it's a real phenomenon. But as you see, I'm still hesitant. I wonder what you think about this. How early can late emerging language impairment be identified by the cognitive, language, and reading factors? So what we found was that from looking at working memory and naming speed in grade 1 is predictive of who's going to be LI, both for the monolinguals and the ESLs, and of the grade 3 variables, phonological short-term memory and vocabulary. Okay? So on the whole, if you look at the early predictors, the early markers, working memory and naming speed in grade 1, and then on top of that, as they get a bit older, if you pick up their phonological short-term memory and vocabulary, all these together help us to predict 95% of the time kids who we think are LI. Okay? So to conclude, it is possible, we think that it's possible to identify children as at risk for late emerging profiles as early as grade 1, even though if you look at both grade 1 and grade 3, we get even better classification. It appears that the indicators, as I said, of late emerging LI are developmental in nature, so it's not the same variables all the time to predict. Certain variables to predict early, and others emerge as significant later. And that limited working memory and slow processing speed are associated with being classified as late emerging LI. So now the question, I'm kind of moving to conjectures about what does it all mean. And so one possibility is it a real phenomenon? Is it real that we have kids who don't appear to have a serious language impairment early on, but suddenly in grade 4 and 5, they emerge as having this language comprehension problem, and that affects their reading comprehension. So is it real? So that's one question. And I think we need to do more studies to replicate this. Maybe Linda with her data can analyze that as well. What we think, though, if it's a real phenomenon, and we're trying to explain it, we think that what happens is in the lower grades, reading the task, the comprehension task may be less demanding linguistically, and therefore those difficulties don't emerge. So those kids kind of surface just below the surface when we don't see them, because they're able to manage, maybe because the reading materials are not as demanding on their working memory and the language. But the reason it's maybe this kind of shift from learning to read to reading to learn, reading to learn to learning to read. Suddenly, as the materials become more demanding, then issues of storage of information and knowledge of the syntactic skills emerges as a reason for this emergence of this subgroup. So we see that limited, so as I said, limited phonological short-term memory and vocabulary are associated with this higher risk of becoming a fully fledged LI, even though they're not. We don't see them early on. So yeah, maybe I'll just finish with this slide. So we talked about some of the methodological and applied issues that I've learned from the research. So we already talked about all this. I mentioned all that before. I think that what also comes into this picture is this idea of mutual facilitation, which Keith Stanley talked about many years ago, between knowing language, between language and comprehension. And that may be one of the reasons also we see this emerging as a subgroup in later years. And as we said, there's no need to wait. If it's really true that there are some kids who are at risk for having a language impairment but they're kind of below the surface, in fact, we could identify them early and figure out what kind of intervention they need. So, I think I'm done. Yes, I see, I'm done.
Time for one quick question.
Yes.
oh, I know that that could come before or after the CNAL, something that they know without conscious knowledge, and whether that's what you think about or what you want to think, but the decision and the different contributions that they make to the recomprehension of the
That's very interesting. That's very possible. Because the way we were kind of thinking was that the syntactic structures that the kids are exposed to, by the time they go to 5, are more complex and make more demands. But you're suggesting the procedure of not like, actually, it's part of the same. Explanation, just elaborate.
So I have quite a few comments that I want to make that actually suggested also with Linda's talk. I just mentioned them and there's a lot of work to be done. So the first thing that came to my mind when you talked about it is what we know from brain research, that at the brain level there's no multitasking. The brain cannot do multitasking. It can only do one thing at a time. And when people say, I do multitasking, it's actually the brain works back and forth. So the ability to somehow measure it with the students with the words seems to be important. The second one is that we know, and that comes out of the research we do in math education, and what Piaget was saying, whenever you come to coordination of 2 or more things, it is magnitudes more harder than just do one thing at a time and combine and do each of them separately. The third point is that we know from work with kids, a kid may do certain operations with easy numbers, so they can do 5, 10, 15, 20, but when you ask them to count by 7s, they stop after 7 or 14. So, and the last point about what seems to be corresponding with math, we talk about units of units of units. So 10 is 10 units of 1, and 100 is 10 units of 10 units of 1. It looks like a word would be 1. Sentence that you have to make sense of, made of a few words, would be a unit of that thing. And then a paragraph that you have to make sense of would be a unit of unit of unit. These 4 observations suggest that if you could go and measure the number of words that students can make sense of, first it might be 2, then 3, then 5, then 19, I don't know, as early and whenever they can do that. And then the violation of expectations, so when you put that in the wrong order and they recognize or not, which I think also was brought up, these might be 2 measures that are settling on conceptual aspects of combining things together.
I think it makes sense what you're saying, absolutely. So, but even if you look at sentences, I'm not sure. I don't know how I would quantify, but there's a difference between saying I like candies and I like ice cream versus I like candies but I don't like ice cream. So even though it's the same number of words in this one sentence, but the second one is more complex in terms of the ideas, in terms of the cognitive demands, I would say, than the first one. So I would say that we need to also look within sentences. We need to look at sentence complexity and what kind of demands it makes on working memory. And
That's the point of coordination.
Yes.
Kind of coordination in
Yes.
those words. It makes it correct.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. Hi.
Wanted to ask if you, for the late emergent problem, kid problem, did you also have evidence from what was going on in the classroom in terms of grades and achievements and all this, because it has ecological validity?
I absolutely did the class, but you know what, we were barely managing all this testing related to the 14 schools. And I wish we did, but we don't. However, I totally agree with you. I would say from a methodological perspective, we have many schools and about 50 or 60 classrooms. So I don't think we have the effect of one teacher is very good and one that's very lousy. This is a much more representative sample. But
drops in achievements.
Sorry?
To see if there's any significant drop in achievements for these kids. It might be interesting just to get the rates and get suggestions.